Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
We're your hosts, Rick Heemstra
and Lindsay Calloway. Today, Rick is talking with Dr. Bruce Gunther and Jonathan Chadwick. Bruce is a professor of church history and Mennonite studies at Trinity Western University's Acts seminaries. His work as a Canadian church historian has also made him an expert in understanding the Christian religious landscape in Canada.
Bruce is joined today by Jonathan Chadwick, a graduate research assistant working on his MA in Christian Studies at Acts seminaries.
Recently, Bruce and Jonathan received a grant to describe the changing Canadian Christian landscape over the last 50 years and to develop better ways to measure the demographics of Christianity in Canada.
Bruce and Jonathan, in my work, when I get calls about research, the most common question by far is, how many of you evangelicals are there anyway? And there were a lot more of these calls in the past when the Reform Party was around, and that was recognized that there were a lot of evangelicals that were active in the Reform Party. And these calls came from media, they came from church planters, pastors, academics, denominational leaders. Why does everyone want to know, and why does it matter?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have a sneaking suspicion, Rick, that the nature of these calls and the direction of these conversations has changed a little bit since the Reform Party was around as well.
Yes, I'm sure they have.
And I suspect also that one of those changes has something to do about the curiosity and maybe even the concern about whether Canada has the same kind of evangelical influences that might be associated with the support of Donald Trump in the United States. And then I think the corollary question that I suspect probably comes up as well is how much does, if that kind of correlation exists, the kind of shadow of influence extends into Canada, how does that influence Canadian culture and Canadian politics? I think one of the things that I would also say in response to your question about why does it matter is because of the way American narratives about religion in society continue to cast their shadow over the understanding of religion in Canada. And the assumption that I encounter very commonly, very frequently, is that evangelicals in Canada are just simply a way station or just another expression of American evangelicalism, or more precisely, white evangelical, American evangelicalism. And I wish we could do something to dispel some of that ignorance. I wish there were better ways by which to help Canadian media, Canadian scholars, Canadian public, Canadian church leaders to understand the demographics and the character of Canadian Christianity and how the demographics and how the character of Canadian Christianity differs from American demographics and Christianity.
Well, so you brought that up. Can we talk a little bit about that? First of all, what's sort of your inkling about some of the differences that you see between American Christianity and Canadian Christianity? And what are some of your inklings about how we might capture that better?
I think, first of all, Canadian Christianity has this Catholic story that immediately makes up about 50% of the Canadian Christian story. And that's not nearly such a dominant part of the American story. Then when one looks more specifically at some of the developments within Protestantism, I don't think Canadian Protestantism has been characterized historically by the same kind of divisive fundamentalism that created a kind of a two-party Protestantism within American Christianity. We have hints of that kind of fundamentalist influence in Canada, but it's not nearly as extensive as it was in the United States. And I think also the denominational makeup of American Christianity is quite different than the denominational makeup of Canadian Christianity, or at least the proportions of that denominational makeup are substantially different. So, one example is you don't have nearly as many Southern Baptists playing a role in Protestantism within Canada, and certainly not nearly the same sort of role that Southern Baptists play in American Christianity. The Southern Baptists are quite a minor Baptist group within Canadian denominationalism. I would say another huge difference that's certainly come to the fore in the last decade is the very different race and ethnic distributions that are part of Canadian Christianity. Historically, also, people have suggested that Canadian Christianity, Canadian evangelicalism maybe in particular, is like Canadian culture in general, more irenic than American Christianity. And another thing that comes to mind really quickly too is the way in which Protestant voting patterns express themselves is quite different in Canada than it is in the US. I think probably, and this may come as a surprise to some people, is that, and when one looks specifically at evangelical voting patterns, they tend to follow regional lines rather than almost anything else. Or to put that differently, the voting patterns of evangelical Protestants in Canada are distributed more or less the way in which voting patterns manifest themselves in different regions. So the West, evangelicals in the West vote different than evangelicals in the East or in Central Canada and so on.
Yeah, we've done some work on that here at the EFC as well, and that's what we found. Evangelicals tend to vote like their neighbors. I'm going to bring this back a little bit to just the question of counting. We have different groups in Canada that do counts on religion, like Statistics Canada does it on the census and on the general social surveys. Denominations and churches do counting, academics do counting. I think we have an idea of how and why churches are interested in counting, but why are some of these other groups interested?
I think the federal government's interested because it has a responsibility for general oversight of what takes place within society. One of the things that they've done recently is they created a public database of all charities. Virtually every religious group is included in that database of charities. And they've done, I think, a real service to the Canadian public in making information available and accessible about what these charities actually do, many of which are religious groups. There's sort of a sense of responsibility for helping a Canadian public understand what groups that claim to have charitable status or want to pursue charitable status, what they actually do and how they use their resources, how they're organized. I think federal governments probably are somewhat interested too in the actual dollars that are involved with religious groups. Like, how do they spend their money? Are they trying to influence politics? Are they actually doing what they say they're doing or want to be doing? So I think they're looking for consistency. And then I think governments at a provincial level use some of this data too. They're interested in knowing how much money these charities actually and religious groups actually spend on stuff like caregiving and how that might dovetail then with the mobilization of resources and distribution of resources within local communities. Municipal governments, I think they care about how many religious groups there are in their community because it helps them respond to requests in urban planning for building buildings, building schools, building institutions, and where those are best located. Those are just some examples, I think, that come to mind for why governments might be interested in counting. They're probably interested also actually in how these groups vote, truth be told.
Bruce, you and I had some conversation about the 2001 census, and this was back several years ago when StatCan was planning a consultation on the census. And to their credit, they do this every time. They ask interested groups from different levels of society to have input on what the questions are. And, I think in the past, this has been an issue, especially around the religion question. I know that prior to the 1971 census, evangelicals were mostly invisible in the census. And I read some of their census coding documents where they instructed people compiling the census that if, for instance, they saw this evangelical denomination, they were to place them inside of one of the mainline Protestant denominations. And my own personal take on that is that they saw the kind of mergers that went on with creation of the United Church in 1925, and there was an assumption at least around that period that these mergers would continue, and they were just sort of anticipating where these evangelical groups would eventually get absorbed by the mainline denominations. Now, things improved a lot after 1971, but I know that you had a role in that consultation. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and how you think the census might improve in terms of its counting of Christians because of your talk with StatCan.
Well, Rick, I think you deserve a lot of credit for being a person in Canada who's done one of the deepest dives into some of those older code books trying to figure out exactly how Stats Canada staff categorized a variety of responses, particularly from individuals who could be identified as belonging to this cluster of evangelical denominations. And I think you're quite right, too, in pointing out that Stats Canada didn't actually know how to manage the responses that they got from this emerging cluster of evangelical groups. I think the way in which the responses have been categorized over time, I think illustrate John Webster Grant's sort of famous line in the 1980s when he talked about the emergence of these evangelical Protestant groups in Canada as being the proverbial cloud on the horizon. Nobody expected most of these evangelical upstart groups in the early 20th century to actually become very significant in the overall picture. But in hindsight, one can see quite clearly now that it's actually completely realigned the demographics of Canadian Christianity. Anyway, that's a bit of a diversion, historical diversion from where your question, I think, was going. But you do deserve a lot of credit for doing that deep dive in those code books and pointing out some of the problems, identifying some of the problems. In preparation for this most recent census, I can't recall exactly how the connection first came about, but I ended up in conversation with the person who's responsible for finalizing several of the questions on the upcoming census, including the religion question. And somehow that led then to a conversation about being involved in helping compile a comprehensive list of denominations in the country, and with a view towards building a better classification system for the kind of responses that Census Canada was getting in response to the religion question. And in the past, for the last number of census questionnaires, there have been approximately 110. There's been a list of about 110 different options into which different responses could be included. And census, the StatsCan people were quite aware that this was a completely inadequate list. And so they weren't just thinking about adding, a few more denominations to this list. They were actually thinking about doing a comprehensive overhaul, which was a really interesting and helpful overture on their part. And so it was a really good opportunity to help shape that overhaul, which is one of the reasons then I spent several months actually working on compiling this comprehensive denomination, because I felt given my past experience in this thing, I was probably one of the few people in the country in a position to actually pull that off. So I was shocked actually at what I discovered. From 200 and some denominations that I had been aware of, there was now an increase to well over 330. And a lot of this proliferation of new denominations has come about within the last 30, 40 years.
Now, are we just talking about Christian denominations here?
Yeah, and that's a good point, because the list of 108 or 110 or however many that Census Canada list was included all religious groups, not just Christians. So it might be that maybe 60, 70 plus of the 110 would have been designated specifically to Christian groups. Whereas now we discover, oh, geez, we actually have, way over 330. So that was one task. And then, of course, there's conversations about, what ought to be the threshold, the number threshold that would justify the inclusion of a particular denomination into this response list on the part of Census Canada. Make a long story short, from 110 or 108 or however many were on the list that they're using now for classifying responses is something upwards of 270.
Bruce and Jonathan, we asked you to come on the Faith Trends podcast because you're about to do some counting. And I was wondering, Jonathan, could you briefly tell us a little bit about what you're planning to do?
So we've taken this list that Bruce assembled of 330 some denominations, and we've categorized them into 15 different subgroups. And our goal is to find, 3 main points of data for each of these denominations. So we want to find how many churches are in each denomination, how many members they have, and then what's their average weekly attendance. And we want to find this data for the period of 1980 to this present year. And we're highly curious how these numbers relate to the data that the census publishes. So we've kind of chosen to make our key target years for data the same years as the census. So 1981, 1991, 2001, 2011, and then this present year in 2021.
So if I understand you right, then Jonathan, you're planning to collect a data point for every decade then.
Yeah.
And that would be on the ones, because the census collects their data on 91, 2001, 2011, etc.
Yeah. And as a side note, I mean, 2021 is a particularly challenging year. One, it's not over yet. So a lot of churches haven't gathered all the data, but also COVID has really, I think, affected particularly attendance numbers. So we've made a conscious decision just to use data up to 2019 or early 2020, essentially before COVID restrictions were put in place. The COVID question, how COVID has affected Christian practice in Canada, is going to need an entirely different research project. And so for the sake of making sure our data is useful, we've decided just to stop at 2019 for attendance specifically.
Okay, and you have received a grant in order to do this research. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Congratulations, by the way.
Yeah, it's a grant that is administered by Trinity Western University, and it's part of Trinity Western's larger distribution of research or research funding that's received from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council.
So one of the things that we've talked about is finding a better way to measure religion. And so far, Jonathan just told us that you're looking for congregation counts, membership counts, and I think it was average weekly service attendance. What other measures are you looking at? Or I know it's early in your research, but what kinds of measures are you anticipating? And why do you think that those measures would give us a better picture of the religious landscape in Canada?
Probably the first thing to say is that even the categories of membership and attendance have their complications. Different denominations understand membership differently. Attendance is also a complicated category. It might seem pretty simple, at first glance, how many people showed up on, let's say, on a Sunday morning. Just count them, and there's your number. But this gets way more complicated when one considers the fact that a significant proportion of people who do attend church regularly might only show up once a month or twice a month. And so the people whom you count on any given Sunday might not be the same people you're going to count on the very next Sunday.
And I know some denominations count people served in a week, so they're kind of like McDonald's, right? People served. And others will count adults, and some will count members. And I know from some small church research that we're doing right now that when we ask small churches about how they do their counting, they say, well, the form comes at the end of the year and the denomination wants a number. And I just kind of think, yeah, we've had about 30 people here. And they write that in. And so they're estimating, not really counting. And all of those differences make a big difference.
They do. They're helpful, but they may not be exact. And they might, in fact, those estimates might, in fact, sometimes be influenced by what a friend of mine used to call an evangelistic estimate. So, nevertheless, however, regardless of how precisely accurate some of these numbers actually are, to try and get a comprehensive idea is still, I think, sort of a worthwhile metric to try and pursue. Behind the scenes, I am also kind of interested in looking at some other patterns if we can figure them out. One of the subplots to some of these denominations that intrigues me is the number of new denominations that start with connections to denominational bodies in other countries. At first, I was quite interested in the number of denominational bodies connected to denominational headquarters, usually in the United States. And so I was interested in the process of Canadianization of denominations in Canada. But now, in the last 20 years, we've got all kinds of new denominations that have headquarters distributed all over the world. So there's an internationalization or a globalization of Canadian Christianity that's taking place. And so I'm curious to try to find ways to track that and to highlight that.
One example of that would be the Redeemed Christian Church of God. It's headquartered in Nigeria, I believe, and that's different than the United States. And Jesus is Lord. It's a Filipino denomination. So yeah, the influences are coming from all different parts of the world. Now, Bruce, you've done this kind of work before. I know that in 2001, you worked with Outreach Canada and you compiled tables very similar to the ones that you're talking about compiling now, and they have been used by all kinds of different groups, and it's such a gift to the church and indeed Canada. That was 2001, and I know that people would come to me and they'd be looking for these numbers, and I say, well, to my knowledge, the most recent complete table is 2001, and I would always tell them this is produced by Bruce Gunther and Outreach Canada. Why has it taken so long? Was there just not interest out there? Why the delay? And why hasn't? Well, and if you didn't do it for an update, why didn't somebody else?
You of all people, Rick, will know how difficult it is to gather data from 330 plus different denominations. Jonathan is discovering the enormity of the scope of this. We're hoping to compile as much data of this kind of data, the membership and attendance kind of data, as is available somewhere. Part of the problem, so scope is one problem, one issue. The second thing is connections, contacting all of these groups and then connecting with the people inside these denominations that might have some idea about where such data exists or how to go about obtaining it. A third challenge, I think, is that in some instances, the data simply doesn't exist. And Jonathan and I have talked about this problem. Some denominations don't keep track, or at least if they do, not very well and in very incomplete ways. And so part of our challenge is also then to try and figure out, okay, how many churches does this group have? Are they small congregations? Are they medium-sized congregations? Are they large congregations? And can we build some sort of algorithm or formula that might help us to compile some reliable estimates of what the numbers approximately are in some of these denominations? Doing all of that in a comprehensive kind of way takes a fair bit of detailed time mixed together with a sense of what the overall denominational picture looks like in the country. And there's just not a lot of people who have tried to do that.
Jonathan, what are some of the challenges that you've run into so far, for example?
Yeah, even just getting churches to respond to emails or phone calls and stuff is its own challenge. But finding contact information is difficult too. We've been so grateful for the EFC and how you've helped us create good connections within the evangelical world. And we're looking for similar contacts who can help us get data from other communities, like someone who can connect us with Catholic groups or Orthodox groups. If we're going to successfully get data from over 330 denominations, we're only going to be able to do that if we can partner with key community leaders or gatekeepers in basically every Christian group. And it's been challenging to find those people so far.
So let's talk a bit about this. You're going to need to partner with denominational groups, and what's in it for them? Why should a denomination, when you call, why should they pick up the phone or return your email or take time to help you compile these stats? Now, I think it's really important, and I'm going to jump in and sort of defend the project because, I'm a bit of a nerd about these stats as well. And I think that they're important, but what would you say to denomination leaders?
It's a good question. And it's probably when I'm explaining this project to friends or family, that's probably the first response I get is why. And I think it will be tremendously helpful to have this large picture of Christian practice in Canada at the end, but also have that information on the denominational trends or even the different subgroups that we've categorized. So like trends in Baptist groups or evangelical groups and things like that. And to have the individual participation from all these denominations just makes that data more useful. And I think it will be add a different, perhaps, perspective than the data that is published by Census Canada. I think it's going to add an interesting perspective, one that will be helpful.
Just a little bit about the different perspective. I know that in my own work, if you look at the census data they changed the question from census to census. Usually it's around the suggested group of religions that could be answered. And when one falls off that list, their numbers go way down the next time. When one gets added, their numbers go way up. And sometimes in the exact opposite trajectory that you would see in the church's own stats. And so that becomes a really important thing.
To both of the observations that the two of you make, I think church leaders are looking for better data and data that's based upon actual practice within their particular groups. And membership and attendance may not be perfect. It isn't the perfect metric, but it's a better metric than affiliation data. The sort of general affiliation, the general question that the census questionnaire asks for. Affiliation can mean such a broad range of things, and it doesn't necessarily correlate or is connected in any way to how the decisions that people actually make to participate within a particular religion. That's one of the reasons why membership and attendance is so important, and one of the reasons why I think church leaders are interested in this. Church leaders, I think, as Jonathan already indicated, they're interested in knowing sort of how their particular denomination compares and the trends that they see or that they intuitively perceive within their denomination, how they fit alongside other denominations that they see as either comparable to theirs or that are part of the larger family of churches to which they belong. That's why I think our classifications are important, and why I think doing reports eventually by classification and not just aggregate totals, I think will be of interest. I think what a project like this also does, and it's by no means the only way to go about doing this, but what it does is it provides a little bit more detailed texture to some of the broad, general, thematic studies that have been done on Christianity in Canada. And those broad, general studies, thematic studies, are really, really good, really, really important. But at the end of the day, people practice their religion, practice Christianity within specific congregations that belong to particular traditions. So there is this case, I think, to be made that looking at the practice of Christianity through a denominational lens is an important way to supplement some of the other studies, more general studies that are also being done, Christianity in Canada.
You know, some of the ways that these numbers are just important for the work of the EFC. You know, we know in Canada that the age of Christendom is over, and we don't want to inflate our numbers, nor do we want to undercount our numbers. But for work like our work in the courts and on Parliament Hill, whenever you apply to intervene in a court case, one of the things you put in your affidavit is the community that you represent. We need good numbers to represent the community that is behind EFC, that is part of our affiliate base. And if you go to make a representation to a parliamentary committee, again, they want to know, who do you represent? And so these numbers sort of underpin our ability to sort of engage in the public square. It's a number, but it's a number that opens doors and allows you a seat at the table to participate. And the better numbers that we can have, I just think that that's better for our overall access to have these conversations.
I totally agree.
So in the coming months, you're going to be contacting denominational leaders. What can they expect when they get a call from you? What are you going to be asking them for, and what do you hope they'll do for you?
Well, we've tried to make it as easy as possible for them. So we've set up a website, and on it is just an explanation of the project, but also a form that they can fill out to just share the data with us directly if they have it accessible. A lot of denominations have been able to do that, and that's been great. We're just most interested in the numbers for those key decades, the 1981, 1991. If denominations don't have that data readily available, I think we're more open for a conversation to maybe figure out how to approximate those numbers or how to find data for non-census years that can maybe fill the place of those census years. What I'm discovering now is denominations reply to emails or phone calls they're all in different states of where they keep their data. So some, they don't have any electronic records, so they're in an archive somewhere. And some denominations have it within minutes, they can send it to me. So it's going to be one of the challenges. Each of these denominations is going to have a different response, and we're going to have to be as flexible as we can with each of them.
So my last question before we wrap up, when are you going to publish this? When are we going to have results? When are we going to have you back on the Faith Trends podcast where you're going to talk about everything that you've learned, and how is that going to be accessible to denominations and church leaders and just people who are just interested in the work you're doing?
We hope to have this done by October 31st. We just don't know which year.
Well, could you narrow it down? Just pick a target year for our listeners.
I mean, it'd be great. It would be great if we can start generating some reports by next summer. I think that would be realistic. As Jonathan said, every denomination is its own unique story, and finding a way to get reliable data from each denomination probably requires some sort of individualized attention and effort. I mean, we can send out a bundle of emails. We can try through, and you've been really helpful actually, Rick, in creating contacts for evangelical Protestant denominations across the country. So thank you for that. We're looking for doing that in other denominational clusters. But at the end of the day, it's exactly as Jonathan said, the data and accessing the data requires some sort of individualized touch in each denomination. And the sooner we can do that, and sooner we can get that done, the sooner I think we can generate reports. I think that the actual process of generating some of the tables and the reports isn't going to be that difficult if we just had the raw data. So as soon as we can, it would be really nice if we could coincide some of the release of our data with the census data. That was the original idea and the goal, so that we could place kind of a 40, 50-year longitudinal study of trends alongside this comparable kind of census data.
Well, we look forward to it. We'll be looking for it next summer. And we hope to have you back on when you've got data to talk about. Bruce Gunther, Jonathan Chadwick, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rick.
That was my interview with Bruce Gunther and Jonathan Chadwick. I'm now joined by Lindsay Calloway, my co-host. Lindsay, what did you think about the interview?
I think my impressions were I was surprised at how much convincing it seemed that denominational leaders needed to see this research as relevant and important. Whereas the government sees it as important, the media wants to know all about how many evangelicals and Christians there are, but it seems like a harder sell to the people that they're actually counting. I found that pretty fascinating.
I think sometimes we don't realize, just the administrative burden that denominational leaders have. And I often think that it's not that they don't want to provide this data, it's that in all the other things that they're doing, sometimes the simple things like counting get pushed down to the bottom of their agenda. Counting is important for denominations and Christians to have a really good self-understanding of their place, both in their communities, in their denominations, in their societies. I think that sometimes when we're trying to figure out what it's like to be a Christian in a post-Christendom world, we can either be defensive and reactionary and assert that we have a greater influence than we really do, or the other error is to think that we don't have any influence in our society at all, and we don't have any place in public conversations. And this is why I think that this conversation that I had with Bruce and Jonathan in their research is just so important, because it's a conversation about how we really know what our influence is.
I think another thing that struck me is, so you've won me over that I think that we should be counting and that it's valuable for our self-perception. But then hearing about how difficult it is actually to count. It's not just a matter of walking in on a Sunday and seeing how many heads are in the pews, but it's looking at the difference between membership and attendance, and what does regular attendance actually mean. It's not even measured weekly anymore. We look at it monthly. So I think what Bruce said at one point was you could walk in on any given Sunday and have a different count each day. So how do we find a measure that is accurate? And then even looking at different denominational archives, some are electronic, some are still physical records, some count members, some count people served, I think you said, Rick. So it's just not as simple as doing a head count. And I was really struck by how much of a task they really are taking on. And at one point, I think Bruce said, we really do have to spend some individual attention to honor every unique denomination and unique story that is out there. Again, it's not just this high level, broad understanding of the Christian landscape in Canada, but it's looking at every individual denomination and learning about their particularities of how they view their denomination, how they view the people who associate with it, and then kind of giving us a snapshot of what each denomination does with that information. That was, I think, some of the particularities and the difficulties and challenges of measuring to begin with, and then of understanding how those measures are even processed at each denominational level was something that struck me and stood out as well.
I think we're very fortunate to have a scholar like Bruce Gunther and then Jonathan Chadwick doing this research, because Bruce has the historical context that can help him know what a number means. And to know what a number means historically in the context of a particular denomination or tradition. And I think that we're going to get better numbers because of what he knows and how he understands the church.
And by better, you mean more accurate. Is that right?
More accurate, and also when it comes to finding those different measures, he will be aware of how to interpret numbers. For instance, if you ask for people's attendance, Bruce will be in a good position to know why a number for one denomination should be treated differently than what is supposed to be the same number from another denomination. And he'll understand historically and within their context why these numbers mean different things.
Yeah, that's helpful. Bruce was almost saying that numbers can tell a story, and that each denomination has a different story to tell. And so to honor the story of each denomination, it takes individualized attention and understanding for each of them. And so we want to understand what these stories are and what story they're telling through their numbers.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.